Imagine you're sitting in a meeting. Someone asks you to walk them through something you read about last week. You try to explain it and it is gone. All gone. You remember it clicking, but the actual content, the reasoning, the structure, the specifics all vanished. There is not a focus problem. There is not an intelligence problem, and it is not random. There's a specific reason this keeps happening, and once you understand it, you can fix it. And that's what this video is about. Here is the situation most people have been in. You are reading something, a book, an article, a report, something that actually matters to you. You hit a passage that is slightly complex, you slow down, you reread it, and then somewhere in the third or fourth read it opens up. The logic becomes visible, the pieces connect, you think, yes, I've got this, and you move on. An hour later, you try to explain what you read to someone else, a colleague, a friend, yourself in your own notes, and you find that what you can produce is approximately the title, one vague impression, and the feeling that it was interesting. The detail is not there, the reasoning is not there. So what happened? Here is what was actually going on in your brain during the reading session. Your brain has two fundamentally different systems involved in learning. The first is working memory. Think of it as your mental workspace. It is where active thinking happens. When you were rereading the passage, working memory was running hard, holding the earlier part of the sentence while processing the later part, connecting this paragraph to the one before it, building the model of what the author was arguing. And it worked. That is why comprehension happened. Working memory did its job. But here is what working memory cannot do. It cannot store anything permanently. It is not built for storage. Research by cognitive psychologist Alan Baddeley, whose model of working memory remains the most widely cited framework in the field, describes working memory as a limited capacity system, one that holds information actively in play but releases it as soon as attention moves elsewhere. The window is short. Most estimates place it as somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds for unrehearsed information. When you finish that complex passage and moved on to the next one, working memory let it go. It had to. It needed the space for what was coming next. This is the first radical distinction the video is built on. Understanding something is a working memory event. Remembering something is a long-term memory event, and these are not the same process. Comprehension tells you that information passed through your mind successfully. It doesn't tell you that the information was transferred into long-term memory storage. That transfer, which neuroscientists call encoding, requires something additional, something most people never do. Not because they are lazy, but because nobody told them it was necessary. The feeling of understanding is real, but it is not evidence of encoding. It is evidence that working memory did its job. Long-term memory requires a separate process to do its job, and that process is almost entirely under your control. This is actually good news. If forgetting were a fixed rate, if it were about the size or quality of your memory, there would be nothing to do, but it is not. It is about what happens in the minutes and hours after understanding occurs, and that is changeable. So why does understanding feel like learning? There is a second reason this keeps happening, and it compounds the first. When information flows smoothly, when a passage reads easily, when an explanation makes sense, when a concept clicks, the brain generates a feeling of familiarity, and the feeling of familiarity is interpreted almost automatically as evidence of learning. Psychologists call it the fluency illusion. The smoother the processing experience, the more learned the material feels, even when nothing has been stored. The problem is that rereading and reviewing feels productive. The content becomes familiar, familiarity feels like learning, but familiarity is recognition. And recognition is not the same cognitive process as recall. You are training yourself to recognize information in the presence of the cue, which is useless when the cue is not there. Research by Ashe Coriat and Robert Bjork, published in 2005, documented this precisely. People consistently rate their learning as higher when processing feels easy, but those ratings are systematically wrong. Easy processing and durable learning are not the same thing. In fact, they're often inversely related. So why does this matter? Think about the most common way people engage with material when they want to learn. They read it, it makes sense, they feel satisfied, they move on. Or they watch a video explanation, the presenter is clear, the logic follows, the viewer feels like they've learned something, and they close the tab. In both cases, the fluency of the experience, the absence of struggle, is generating a false signal. The brain says it is familiar, this is understood, this is learned, but familiarity is not retention. Comprehension is not consolidation. Henry Rodiger and Jeffrey Karpik demonstrated in 2006 what is now one of the most replicated findings in learning science, that people who reread material score significantly lower on delayed recall tests than people who attempt to retrieve it actively, even when the rereaders spend more time with the content. Retrieval practice, despite feeling harder and producing more errors in the moment, produces dramatically better long-term retention. The mechanism is important here. The difficulty of retrieval is not a sign that learning is failing. It is a signal that learning is happening. There's a practical implication for this. So if you finished reading something and it felt smooth, that smoothness is not a reliable signal that you will remember it. It is a signal that working memory processed it successfully. The question to ask is not, did I understand this? The question is, can I reconstruct this without looking at it? Those are very different questions. The first is a test of comprehension, and the second is a test of encoding. And the second is the only one that predicts whether you will be able to use that information later. Encoding is not one thing. It is a cluster of decisions. How deeply you process, how you explain it to yourself, and whether you are practicing recall in the same conditions that you will need it. Each of these decisions has a different impact. In 1972, psychologists Fergus Craig and Robert Lockhart proposed what became one of the most influential frameworks in memory research, levels of processing theory. The central finding was that the durability of a memory trace is determined by the depth at which information is processed, not by the amount of time spent with it. Shallow processing, such as reading words, recognizing symbols, passive exposure, produces weak, rapidly fading memory traces. Deep processing, such as connecting new information to existing knowledge, generating meaning, applying concepts to new contexts, produces significantly stronger and more durable traces. The distinction matters enormously because most of the ways people engage with material they want to learn are shallow processing activities. Rereading is shallow, highlighting is shallow, listening to a clear explanation is shallow. All of this feel productive, but none of them reliably produce durable encoding. So what does deep processing look like? Deep processing is not complicated, but it requires deliberate effort. It means doing something generative with information rather than receiving it passively. 3 specific activities that reliably produce deep encoding include: first, connection to prior knowledge. When you encounter new information and actively ask, where does this fit with what I already know? So that is deep processing. What does this remind me of? What does this contradict? Here you are building associative links in long-term memory. The new information is not stored in isolation. It is connected to an existing network, which makes it dramatically easier to retrieve later. The second activity is self-explanation. Closing the source and attempting to explain the concept in your own words to yourself, on paper or aloud, forces your working memory to reveal what is actually encoded versus what merely felt familiar. Gaps appear immediately. Those gaps are not failures. They are the most valuable diagnostic information available about what still needs encoding. The third activity is application application to a novel situation, asking how would this work in a situation I have not encountered before, requires the brain to extract the underlying principle rather than the surface example. Transfer appropriate processing research developed by Maurice, Bransford and Franks in 1977 showed that information encoded in terms of its underlying structure transfers far more successfully across context than information encoded as a specific example or specific phrasing. And here is the key insight. Encoding is not something that happens to you while you read. It is something you do after you read. The reading, the watching, the listening, that is input. Input is necessary, but not sufficient. Encoding requires an active output phase, a moment where you put down your source and do something generative with that information. You create something. Even 5 minutes of self-explanation or connection building immediately after reading a complex passage will produce dramatically better retention than an additional 30 minutes of rereading the same material. Deep processing gets the information in, self-explanation makes it meaningful, a transfer appropriate processing makes it retrievable when it counts. Here is the part no one tells you about. So you've encoded something well, you processed it deeply, tested yourself, made it meaningful. You might assume that that's where learning ends. It does not. There is a second process, one that happens entirely without your conscious involvement. And it is just as important as everything that came before it. Even if you encode information well, even if you go through a genuine output phase, test yourself, explain the concept, make connections, there is still a second process that determines whether the memory survives. That process is consolidation, and it happens almost entirely offline while you are not consciously doing anything. Jan Born and Ines Wilhelm at the University of Tübingen have produced detailed research on memory consolidation. Their work, along with the broader neuroscientific literature on sleep and memory, agrees on a remarkably consistent picture. During a slow wave sleep, the hippocampus, the brain's temporary holding area for newly encoded information, replaces the day's learning and gradually transfers it into the cortex, where long-term memories are stored. This is not a metaphor. Neurons that fired during the learning experience fire together again during sleep, strengthening the connections between them. The memory is literally being rebuilt and reinforced while you are unconscious. In other words, your brain does some of its best learning when you think you have stopped learning. So what happens when consolidation is disrupted? The practical implications are significant. Information that is encoded in the evening but is followed by insufficient sleep undergoes incomplete consolidation. The neural replay that would have strengthened the memory trace is cut short. Matthew Walker's research at University of California, Berkeley, that is synthesized in his 2017 book, Why We Sleep, documents that a single night of poor sleep after learning can reduce retention by 20 to 40% compared to equivalent good sleep. This means that two people can go through identical encoding process, same content, same depth of processing, same output phase, and arrive at dramatically different retention outcomes based entirely on what happens in the following 8 hours. Learning and sleeping are not separate activities. Sleep is the second half of the learning process. There is also a timing dimension. Research on spaced practice by Cepeda and colleagues in 2006, a major meta-analysis that covered 317 experiments from over 180 articles, found that the spacing between learning sessions has a quantifiable optimal range depending on how far in the future you need to recall the information. For information you need to retain for months, the optimal gap between study sessions is approximately 1 to 2 weeks. For information that's needed within a week, the optimal range is 1 to 2 days. The principle is consistent. Spacing the repetition of encoding across time with sleep between sessions produces retention that is far more durable than mass practice, regardless of total time invested. The implication is counterintuitive. Doing less in a single session and doing it more times across time with sleep between them outperforms doing more in a single extended session. So putting it all together, everything in this video boils down to a 3-phase process. Most people only do phase 1. Phase 1 is when input with active attention is applied. Engage with the material with the explicit goal of understanding the structure, not just the surface content. Ask, what is the core argument here? What is the logic connecting those pieces? This is still working memory work, but it is working memory used more strategically, building a framework rather than processing details. Phase 2 is encoding through output. Immediately after input, close the source, give yourself 5 to 10 minutes of generative output. For example, write down what you just learned in your own words without looking. Identify where it connects to things you already know. Note what surprised you or what you are uncertain about. This output phase is where encoding actually happens. It is also where you discover what you actually retained versus what merely felt retained. If you cannot produce anything without looking, this is not failure. That is the most accurate signal available about current state of encoding. Go back, re-engage, try again. The attempt itself, the retrieval effort, strengthens the trace even when it fails. Phase 3 is consolidation. Through spacing and sleep, return to the material after a gap, ideally after at least 1 night of sleep. Attempt retrieval again before rereading. What you can retrieve without prompting is genuinely encoded. What you cannot retrieve identifies exactly what needs another encoding cycle. Repeat this process 2 or 3 times across a week, and the information will transfer into long-term memory with the durability that passive rereading across the same total time cannot approach. Mindset shift. The most important shift this video is asking you to make is not a technique. It is a diagnostic tool. After any learning session, the question is no longer, did I understand it? The question is, can I reconstruct it? Understanding is the beginning of learning. Reconstruction is the evidence that learning happened. If you can reconstruct it without prompting, without the source in front of you, the encoding worked. If you cannot, the encoding is incomplete and you now know exactly what to do about it. You need to go through the output phase, spacing, sleep, and then repeat the process. This is not a complicated system. It does not require special tools or significant additional time. It requires a different relationship with the moment after understanding, the moment most people treat as the end of learning, which is actually where learning begins. So to come back to where we started, you are in a meeting. Someone asks you to explain the thing you read last week, and this time something different happens, because this time after you read it, you did not just move on. You closed the source, you tried to reconstruct it, you found the gaps and filled them. You came back 2 days later and tested yourself again. And when you try to explain it, the content is there. Not because your memory improved, not because you are smarter or more focused than before, but because you completed the process that most people stop halfway through. Understanding is not learning. Encoding is learning, and encoding is something anyone can do once they know it exists. If this was useful, there is more in this direction. The research on retrieval practice, interleaving, and the specific conditions that accelerate encoding for different types of material. Subscribe if you want to go further. And if you want to test this today, take something you read this week that you thought you understood, close it, try to write down everything you can reconstruct right now. See what's actually there. And use this as the first encoding session. Stay curious, stay sharp.